A mercy killing shrouded in lies. Who's hiding the truth? Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Halworth. Comment where you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Let's begin. The storm rolled in over the Sussex coastline like a great advancing army, dark, crackling, and merciless. Lightning split the sky with pale, trembling fingers that illuminated the austere facade of Mercy Court, the seaside estate of the wealthy and eccentric philanthropist Lady Eugenia Barrington. The mansion, perched on the cliff's edge, offered a striking silhouette against the churning waves below. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but serene. For tonight, Lady Barrington hosted her annual charity gathering, a discreet affair, known among the elite as the Mercy Killings, a name coined half in jest and half in uneasy admiration of her chosen cause. Raising funds for the compassionate release of terminal patients denied formal assistance. The name lingered over the event like a macabre perfume, amusing to some, unsettling to others. The guests had assembled in the grand drawing room, a chamber of dark oak panels and glittering chandeliers. Fine paintings stared down at the well-dressed crowd with mute solemnity. Glasses clinked. Polite conversation wove through clusters of distinguished attendees. Yet beneath the refined chatter lurked tension, certainly not the sort that typically accompanied a philanthropic evening. At precisely 9:08, a scream cleaved the air. It was a terrible sound, shrill, desperate, unmistakably real. Guests froze. A man dropped his champagne flute, which shattered at his feet in a crystalline cascade. The music halted mid-bar. All eyes turned toward the marble staircase that swept upward into the shadowed upper floors. Moments later, Miss Clara Fenton, Lady Barrington's young secretary, stumbled into view, her face white as bone. "Lady Barrington, oh dear God, she's dead." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Several guests rushed forward, among them Dr. Lionel Creswick, a tall, stern man with a reputation for brusque efficiency, Mrs. Ramilda Vale, a widowed socialite whose eyes missed nothing, and Captain Theodore Marsh, ex-military, dependable yet haunted. Behind them, Inspector Harold Marsham of the local constabulary, who had been on hand as an invited observer of the charity's procedures, wasted no time in asserting control. "Everyone remain here," he commanded sharply. "No one is to leave the room." But the household was already descending into chaos. A nervous murmur rose from the guests. Contradictions surfaced. Some claimed they had heard a quarrel earlier. Others insisted Lady Barrington had retired for a rest only minutes before the scream. Within minutes, Inspector Marsham returned, his face grave. "Lady Barrington has been found in her private study," he announced. "She appears to have been poisoned." A shudder passed through the assembly. Poison, the most intimate of murder methods. The inspector cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances and the nature of tonight's gathering, we must treat this as a homicide." Eyes darted across the room. If it was murder, then the culprit, one of them, was already sealed within the great walls of Mercy Court by the raging storm outside. And it was precisely at that moment, when fear, suspicion, and confusion simmered together, that the doors to the drawing room opened with calm, deliberate grace. In stepped Hercule Poirot. He looked as impeccable as ever, a tailored suit pressed to mathematical precision, shoes gleaming like onyx, his famous moustaches sculpted to perfection. His dark eyes swept across the room, thoughtful, measuring. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said gently, "I regret the unfortunate circumstances under which I intrude, but Inspector Marsham has requested my assistance, as the storm prevents immediate reinforcements and as every person in this room is, how do you English say, a piece of the puzzle. I shall endeavor to aid in the solution." No one spoke. Poirot folded his hands neatly before him. "Let us begin," he said softly, "with order. For in disorder, The truth hides itself like a frightened child. And thus, as thunder groaned overhead and the vast house settled into a tense silence, Hercule Poirot set foot into a mystery steeped in secrets, moral shadows, and motives that reached far deeper than philanthropy. A murder had occurred. A limited number of suspects stood before him, and Poirot, ever the master of the little grey cells, prepared to untangle the affair at the Mercy killings. The guests remained clustered in uncomfortable silence as Poirot moved to the center of the drawing-room. The storm outside continued its furious assault upon the cliffs, each thunderclap seeming to rattle the very bones of Mercy Court. Poirot observed the room with slow, deliberate care, taking in not only the faces, but the subtle tensions that trembled behind them. A glance here, an exchanged whisper there, threads waiting to be pulled. Inspector Marsham stood stiffly at his side. "I've secured the study and posted 2 constables at the door," he murmured. He sounded competent enough, yet Poirot detected the faint tremor of a man newly overwhelmed. "Très bien," Poirot replied. "Now we gather the facts, and for this, we must first gather the people." He raised his voice slightly, each word landing with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would be so kind as to remain where you are, I shall wish to speak with each of you in turn. But first, your names. Order, always order." A moment passed before Captain Theodore Marsh stepped forward, shoulders tense. His military posture faltered for the briefest instant under Poirot's gaze. "Captain Theodore Marsh," he announced, "a friend of Lady Barrington's late husband. She invited me to this year's event as a gesture of old times." Poirot inclined his head. "And were the old times pleasant, mon capitaine?" Marsh hesitated. "Some were, some less so." Poirot let the pause hang before shifting his attention to the next. "Mrs. Romilda Vale." She floated nearer with a graceful rustle of silk, though her eyes glinted sharply. "I am Romilda Vale, Lady Barrington's dear companion in more ways than one. We shared charitable interests, social ties, many connections. Her loss is immeasurable." Poirot noticed her gloved hands clasped too tightly, the knuckles pale. "You admired her greatly." "And envied her at times," she admitted in a low voice. "But isn't that common among friends of strong character?" Poirot made no comment, simply recorded the remark in the ledger of his mind. Next came Dr. Lionel Creswick. His expression revealed irritation more than grief, as though death were an inconvenient interruption. "I've been Lady Barrington's physician for 12 years. Her health was, in many respects, admirable for her age, though not without certain vulnerabilities." Poirot raised a brow. "Poison is not a natural progression of such vulnerabilities." Creswick's jaw tightened. "Certainly not. But I assure you I prescribed nothing that could have caused harm." "You are sure?" Poirot repeated softly, filing the defensive tone for later consideration. Miss Clara Fenton, the trembling secretary, stepped forward last. Her voice wavered. "Lady Barrington depended on me for everything, correspondence, schedules, managing her guests tonight. I can't believe she's gone." Her distress seemed genuine, yet Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "And you were the one who discovered the body, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. "Yes. She sent me to fetch a document from the study. When I entered, she was—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Poirot offered her a small, courteous nod. He suspected the girl was truthful, though truth he knew was rarely the whole story. He turned to the inspector. "And these are all the guests?" "Not all," Marsham replied. "2 others are in the adjoining parlor. They were too shaken to remain here. Shall I bring them in?" Poirot shook his head. "Later. For now, we begin with what is before us." He addressed the assembled group again. "Tell me, if you please, the last you each saw of Lady Barrington." The captain spoke first. "Around 8:30, she excused herself to check on some documents related to the charity fund." Mrs. Vale interjected smoothly. I saw her closer to 9. She was unusually tense. Something had upset her. What sort of something? Poirot asked. Mrs. Vale hesitated just long enough for the hesitation itself to become an answer. Perhaps a disagreement, but she didn't confide details. A quarrel, then, Poirot pressed. A conversation, she corrected, though color rose in her cheeks. Poirot let her revision pass unchallenged, turning instead to the doctor. I saw her at 10 minutes to 9, Creswick asserted. She complained of slight dizziness. Nothing alarming. She waved me off when I suggested rest. Poirot nodded slowly. And you, mademoiselle? Miss Fenton swallowed. I hadn't seen her since 8:15, when she told me to prepare the correspondence trays for tomorrow. Poirot clasped his hands. So we have 4 differing accounts: tension, dizziness, business matters, and silence. Curious. When the stories do not align, one must look not only at the discrepancies but at the reasons behind them. The inspector cleared his throat. Poirot, the study shows no sign of forced entry. The window was locked from the inside. Of course, Poirot murmured. Lady Barrington was not killed by an intruder. She welcomed her killer, or at least expected no harm from them. A visible shiver coursed through several guests. Poirot stepped nearer to the staircase, peering upward with thoughtful eyes. You see, mes amis, murder committed within a home, especially during a gathering such as this, requires a degree of confidence. The killer must know the layout, the habits, the vulnerabilities of the victim. Someone close to her, Miss Fenton whispered. Or someone who wished to appear close, Poirot said. Lightning flashed, bathing the room in cold, white light. Poirot lifted his chin, senses sharpening. I shall now view the study, but before I depart, no one is to wander. Secrets love movement. We must deny them that pleasure. He turned to Mrs. Vale. You mentioned a disagreement. When I return, you will tell me more. Color drained from her face, but she nodded rigidly. Poirot ascended the staircase with unhurried grace, leaving the guests in a taut silence. Each pair of eyes followed him, some fearful, some calculating. Already the fractures in their stories had begun to show, and Poirot, with the storm rumbling behind him and suspicion brewing ahead, felt the faintest stirrings of understanding. The truth was hidden here, somewhere among these people. The threads were tangled, yes, but they were threads all the same, and Hercule Poirot excelled at untangling knots. Poirot's footsteps echoed softly along the upper corridor, each tap of polished leather punctuated by the distant growl of the storm. The lights flickered once, just enough to hint at the vulnerability of the great house beneath nature's temper. He paused outside Lady Barrington's study, where 2 constables stood guard with stiff, anxious expressions. They straightened as Poirot approached. "No one has entered?" he asked quietly. "No, sir," one replied. "Inspector's orders." "Très bien." Poirot nodded and stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The study was a handsome room, richly panelled, though its elegance was now stained by the weight of tragedy. A large mahogany desk dominated the centre, its surface neatly arranged. Almost too neatly, Poirot thought. Lady Barrington, by all accounts, possessed a meticulous mind, yet this arrangement spoke not of habit but of deliberate presentation. Her body still lay slumped in the high-backed chair, awaiting the coroner. Poirot approached with reverence, his gaze softening. "Madame," he murmured, "forgive the intrusion, but your voice, though silenced, must speak through the details you leave behind." He examined her posture, the angle of her head, the faint trace of discoloration around her lips. Poison, yes, but which and how administered? On the desk lay a teacup, its rim faintly smudged. Poirot bent slightly, sniffing. A peculiar bitter scent lingered, not one easily mistaken. He noted the placement. The cup rested on the right side of the desk, though Lady Barrington was left-handed. He had observed the pen on her writing stand earlier in the drawing-room. A small detail, but Poirot never forgot a detail. A left-handed woman would naturally place her cup to the left, unless someone else had arranged it. And Lady Barrington, if she were drinking tea in comfort, would not likely adjust her habits moments before her death. He moved to the window, locked, as Inspector Marsham had said. A lock easily turned from within, yet the dust on the sill was untouched. No escape here. Poirot pivoted back toward the desk, inspecting the papers Miss Fenton had been sent to retrieve. The topmost sheet was a partially typed document. A ledger notation for the Mercy Fund allocations, several entries circled in red. "Ah," Poirot whispered. "Money. It is always in some manner about the money." A faint scuff sounded outside in the corridor. Poirot straightened, alert. The door creaked open and Inspector Marsham appeared, slightly breathless. "I wasn't sure if you needed assistance," the inspector said. But Poirot caught the man's quick glance toward the teacup, the papers, details he pretended to ignore. "You have been thorough in securing the crime scene," Poirot replied politely. "But there is something more important. Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Lady Barrington's financial dealings?" Marsham seemed taken aback. "Financial? Well, I know the charity was large and complex. She handled it with care. What has that to do with the murder?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Everything has something to do with the murder." He walked toward the door. "I am ready to return to the guests. They simmer with unease, and when people simmer, they begin to show cracks." As they descended the staircase, the low hum of troubled conversations drifted upward. Poirot detected the shifting tensions even before re-entering the drawing-room. Mrs. Vale stood by the fireplace, her lips drawn tight. Dr. Creswick paced with measured irritation. Captain Marsh stared out toward the windows, jaw clenched. Miss Fenton hovered near the corner, eyes red from tears. Poirot stepped into the center of the room and silence fell like a curtain. "Mes amis," he began gently, "I thank you for your patience. My visit to the study has clarified some small matters, though many large ones remain." Dr. Creswick abruptly stopped pacing. "Is the poison identifiable?" "Ah, Doctor," Poirot said, tilting his head. "You're eager for technicalities. But remember, in such cases, psychology is the key. The poison itself matters less than the intentions surrounding it." Mrs. Vale drew a sharp breath. "Are you implying that one of us—" "Madame," Poirot interrupted softly, "I imply nothing. I only observe." He let the tension stretch before turning to Miss Fenton. "Mademoiselle, you said Lady Barrington sent you for a document." "Yes," she whispered. "From the study." "But she did not specify which." Miss Fenton shook her head. "No, she just told me to fetch the file for tomorrow. I assumed she meant the correspondence tray." Poirot walked slowly toward her, eyes narrowing with thought. "And did she often use ambiguous instructions?" "She trusted me to know her habits." "Yet tonight her habits were different," Poirot mused. "Very different." Captain Marsh stepped forward. "Poirot, forgive me, but are you suggesting she anticipated danger?" "Non, mon capitaine. I'm suggesting she anticipated something. The distinction is vital." The storm battered the house again. Somewhere upstairs, a shutter slammed loose. Poirot's gaze swept the room. "Now, I must ask, was anyone here aware of Lady Barrington's intention to revise the charity's financial structure?" A ripple of shock moved through the guests, except one. Poirot saw the flicker of recognition in Dr. Creswick's eyes, quickly concealed. Mrs. Vale recovered first. "I knew she planned reforms, yes. She said inefficiencies had crept into the system." "Not inefficiencies," Poirot said quietly. "Misallocations." Dr. Creswick bristled. "You speak as though you know this for fact." Poirot lifted a hand. Because I have seen the evidence myself, in her study, and someone else saw it too. Lady Barrington circled entries marked as suspicious, entries connected to one of you. Silence thickened. Even the thunder seemed to pause. Poirot continued, I do not yet accuse, but the circle tightens. The motive, if motive it is, rests upon money, proximity, and opportunity, and each of these begins to illuminate certain shadows. He turned toward the hallway. But now, Inspector, you must bring in the other two guests, for this mystery is not complete without every piece present. As the inspector hurried to obey, Poirot allowed himself the smallest sigh. The threads he had gathered were beginning to intertwine, but the pattern was still obscured. Lady Barrington's death was no impulsive act. It was deliberate, calculated, and performed by one who understood her habits well enough to alter them convincingly. The killer believed their deception would hold. But Poirot, studying the room once more, already sensed which face betrayed the faintest tremor of fear. Inspector Marsham returned moments later with the remaining guests, ushering them into the already tense drawing room. The first was Mr. Adrian Brett, a pale, soft-spoken solicitor whose damp spectacles suggested he had been nervously wiping them on and off since the moment of the scream. The second was Miss Octavia Reed, a striking woman with sharp features and a reputation, whispered among the guests, for her investigative journalism that skirted the edge of scandal. Both looked unsettled, though Octavia held herself with a composure too deliberate to be natural. Poirot turned his attention upon them with gentle precision. Bonsoir, monsieur, mademoiselle. Please join the others. Your presence is important. Adrian Brett swallowed visibly. Inspector Marsham told us, well, that Lady Barrington, that she has died. Is it truly murder? Poirot bowed his head. I fear so. Octavia Reed's eyes narrowed. This house has enough tension simmering beneath its polished floors to fuel 10 murders. But I suppose we are to pretend shock. A remarkable comment, mademoiselle, Poirot replied softly, and one spoken without hesitation. She lifted a brow. I do not deal in hesitation, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot stepped closer, studying her with mild curiosity. No, I suspect you deal in uncovering secrets, and secrets, as you know, are the currency of murder. She held his gaze unflinchingly, though her fingers tightened around the notebook she carried. Poirot noticed the frayed edges, the indentation of a pencil long held against the cover. A working woman's tool, not merely an accessory. He allowed the tension to settle before addressing all present once more. Now that we have the complete company, I must understand your connections to Lady Barrington. Adrian Brett cleared his throat. I handled some of her legal affairs, her estates, her trusts, the Mercy Fund among them. Poirot inclined his head. Ah, then you know its structure intimately. I suppose. Brett looked at his shoes. She was reviewing documents recently. She asked for clarifications. But I did not know she found something suspicious. Poirot's voice softened. And yet you look as though you feared she did. Brett's mouth opened, then closed again. I simply worry about my work being found lacking. Mrs. Vale scoffed lightly. Your anxiety is chronic, Mr. Brett. Hardly new. Poirot caught the flash of resentment in Brett's expression. Resentment, fear, and something else. A tremor of guilt, though not necessarily the guilt of murder. He turned to Octavia Reed. And you, mademoiselle, your interest in Lady Barrington's affairs. I've been researching a series of philanthropic ventures, she said. Some are pristine, others conceal far less noble intentions. Lady Barrington invited me to tonight's gathering after I confronted her with questions. Poirot's brows rose slightly. Questions she welcomed? She didn't dismiss me, Octavia said. Whether that counts as welcome is debatable. Poirot let this sit with the others before continuing. There is something you all must understand. Lady Barrington knew she was in danger. The changes in her routine, the alterations of her instructions. These are signs of a woman attempting to act swiftly, perhaps before someone could stop her. A collective shiver passed through the room. Captain Marsh frowned deeply. Then she expected an attempt on her life. Expected, Poirot mused. Not quite. She merely sensed that the truth she had uncovered made her vulnerable. Dr. Creswick crossed his arms, his impatience simmering. Poirot, are you suggesting that one of us had both motive and opportunity to silence her because of the fund's discrepancies? Poirot's mustaches twitched thoughtfully. Doctor, I suggest nothing yet, but I note that you and Lady Barrington spoke not long before her death. You said she felt dizziness. I did, Creswick replied sharply. A minor complaint. And yet, Poirot said gently, poison often begins with a minor sensation. Perhaps Lady Barrington had already ingested something harmful by then. Mrs. Vale gasped softly. You think the poison was administered earlier, before she went to the study? It is a possibility, Poirot answered, given that the teacup in her study appears positioned not by her hand, but someone else's. Several faces paled. Poirot caught the small, involuntary flinch from Miss Fenton. Her eyes darted briefly toward the captain, an instinctive search for reassurance or guilt. Poirot continued, the placement of objects, the order of actions. These are the silent witnesses of truth. They tell me that the killer attempted to stage a natural sequence, yet failed to understand Lady Barrington's habits. Inspector Marsham stepped forward. Poirot, do you believe the crime was premeditated? Inspector, Poirot replied quietly, one does not bring poison to a philanthropic gathering without purpose. The thunder boomed again, rattling the distant windows. At that moment, the lights flickered once more, then steadied. Poirot used the brief darkness to observe reactions. Brett clutched his chest. Mrs. Vale flinched. Creswick muttered under his breath. Octavia Reed alone remained still, watching everyone else. Poirot found her calm, both intriguing and telling. Now, he said, returning to the group, I must ask a question of great importance. Who among you knew that Lady Barrington intended to expose financial misdeeds? Silence fell like a stone. Then Octavia's voice pierced it. I did, she said. She admitted as much when I pressed her earlier. She told me she had discovered a betrayal but needed to confirm it. Poirot nodded slightly, having anticipated this. And you did not think to mention this sooner? I'm not here as your assistant, Monsieur Poirot, she replied coolly. Besides, she did not name the betrayer. But she implied one existed, he countered. Yes, Octavia whispered. And that frightened her. Poirot felt the shift ripple through the group. Fear sharpening suspicion, suspicion sharpening nerves. This was the moment when truths began to drip through cracks, when guilt stirred beneath composed expressions. He stepped closer to the fireplace, folding his hands behind his back. There is much still to uncover, but already certain patterns emerge. Our victim uncovered deceit. She sought to correct it, and thus someone believed silence was necessary. Mrs. Vale trembled. Poirot, do you know who it is? Poirot lifted his gaze, his eyes dark and thoughtful. I know this. The killer is among us, and their mistake, small though it may seem, has already begun to betray them. A hush fell once more, deeper than before, and Poirot, sensing the rising tide of panic beneath the polished surface of Mercy Court, knew the next stage of the investigation would reveal far more than any of these guests intended to share. The silence that followed Poirot's declaration did not simply fill the room, it pressed upon it, thick and suffocating. Even the storm outside seemed to recede into the background, allowing the charged atmosphere within Mercy Court to dominate every breath. Poirot, with his hands folded neatly behind him, allowed that silence to linger. He understood its purpose. People spoke too quickly when silence made them uncomfortable. They revealed more than they intended. At last, it was Miss Fenton who broke. "Monsieur Poirot, you said someone made a mistake. What mistake do you mean?" Her voice trembled, though whether from fear or desperate curiosity, Poirot could not yet determine. He turned toward her, his expression gentle but unreadable. "Mademoiselle, the smallest misplacement, the slightest oversight, can unravel the most carefully woven plan. For example, the teacup arranged on the right of the desk." Dr. Creswick frowned. "You mean to say she did not place it herself?" "Precisely." Captain Marsh crossed his arms. "But why would anyone move a teacup after poisoning her? Why risk tampering further?" Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. Perhaps because the killer wished to create a false sequence of events. Perhaps they hoped to suggest she drank the poison here, alone, in her study. Octavia Reed stepped forward slightly, which would imply they wanted the murder to appear self-inflicted, or at least accidental. "Just so," Poirot said. Mrs. Vale let out a strained breath. But who would think Lady Barrington would choose to take her own life at a charity gathering? That notion is absurd. "Yes, madame," Poirot murmured. "To you, absurd. But to one unfamiliar with her private habits, or one desperate enough to attempt misdirection, it may have seemed passable." Poirot let his gaze travel slowly around the room. "Now, we must examine what transpired between her departure from this gathering and her death." Inspector Marsham, eager for something concrete, spoke quickly. "Poirot, shall we take statements in chronological order?" Poirot nodded. "Yes. Begin, if you please." The inspector pointed to Mrs. Vale. "You claimed you saw her shortly before 9. Mrs. Vale stiffened. "Yes, she was anxious. I tried to comfort her, but she dismissed my concern." "Did you argue?" Poirot asked quietly. "No." The reply came too quickly, too firmly. Poirot tilted his head, and Mrs. Vale added hastily, "Not truly. It was merely a disagreement about the distribution of the charity's funds. She believed certain hospitals were misreporting their needs. I felt her suspicions were unfounded." Poirot's eyes glimmered. "And did she accuse you of benefiting from these misallocations?" Mrs. Vale gasped. "Of course not. How dare—" "Then why," Poirot interrupted softly, "did you not mention this disagreement earlier?" Mrs. Vale's cheeks flushed. "I thought it irrelevant." "Everything is relevant," Poirot murmured. He swung his attention to Dr. Creswick. "Doctor, you spoke with Lady Barrington 10 minutes before her death." Creswick rubbed his forehead. "Yes. She complained of lightheadedness. I suggested she rest. She refused." "And you left her alone?" "I had no reason to suspect danger." Poirot paced slowly before him. "Doctor, are you aware of any toxic substances stored in your medical kit that could be misused?" Creswick stiffened. "Poirot, you cannot imply—" "I imply nothing. I merely observe that you were one of the last to see her alive, and you have access to substances others do not." Creswick's lips thinned. "My kit was left downstairs during the reception. Anyone could have tampered with it." Poirot stopped pacing. "A curious defense, Doctor. You offer the possibility of tampering before I even suggest it." Creswick swallowed hard. Poirot turned smoothly to Captain Marsh. "And you, mon capitaine, you said Lady Barrington excused herself for documents. Did she appear distressed?" The captain hesitated. She seemed determined, focused, like she had made up her mind about something. I assumed it was related to her charity presentations. "You noticed nothing unusual in her behavior?" "No." Poirot leaned closer. "And yet, when Miss Fenton screamed, you were the first to rush forward, a man of action." Marsh frowned. "Is that suspicious?" "Sometimes," Poirot said. "It is the instinctive reactions that reveal the most. But not tonight. Not yet." Poirot shifted to Miss Fenton, whose fingers twisted anxiously. "You, mademoiselle, were sent to fetch a file. You went directly to the study? Yes. You did not stop along the way? You did not speak to anyone? She shook her head quickly. No, Monsieur Poirot. I went straight there, and I found her. Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Poirot softened his tone. Courage, mademoiselle. You are doing well. Tell me, did Lady Barrington often send you alone into the study during parties? No, it was unusual. She usually kept her documents with her, or asked me earlier in the day. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, très bizarre indeed. Octavia Reed stepped closer, curiosity lighting her eyes. Poirot, you believe she discovered something tonight? Something that frightened her? Not frightened, Poirot corrected. Alarmed. There is a difference. A woman who is frightened withdraws. A woman who is alarmed acts swiftly. Lady Barrington was a woman who acted. He paused meaningfully. She sent Miss Fenton away. She arranged her desk. She prepared papers, almost as though she intended to confront someone. Someone in this room. Mrs. Tregore. Vale's breath hitched. Confront them with what? Poirot looked at her steadily. With proof of betrayal. A ripple of shock passed through the group. Poirot continued quietly, but she never reached that confrontation. Someone reached her first. Adrian Brett's voice emerged in a strangled whisper. Are you saying she planned to accuse one of us? No, monsieur. I'm saying she did accuse someone. Poirot's gaze sharpened. But not verbally, with her actions, her urgency, her unusual instructions, her circled documents. He straightened, his eyes bright with understanding. And the killer, whoever they are, knew she was about to expose them. That is why they acted tonight. The storm howled through the chimneys, as if echoing Poirot's words. He stepped back into the center of the room, gathering their fearful faces with a single sweep of his gaze. The pattern is forming, mes amis, and soon the smallest detail, the tiniest misstep, will reveal everything. Poirot clasped his hands once more. But first, I must ask a final question, one that will decide the direction of this investigation. He paused, letting the room freeze. Who here visited the study earlier tonight, before Lady Barrington died? No one moved, but Poirot had already seen the truth flicker across one face. For a long, suspended moment, no one breathed. Poirot's question lingered in the room with the precision of a scalpel. Sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The assembled guests shifted uneasily, each subtly confirming their innocence by their very reluctance to speak. Yet Poirot had already seen what he needed. A tremor, slight but unmistakable, in the posture of Adrian Brett. It was not guilt written across his face. No, guilt came later. What Poirot detected instead was the startled fear of someone whose secret had been brushed by an unexpected hand. He let the silence stretch before fixing Brett with a gentle, piercing gaze. Monsieur, perhaps you would begin. Brett blinked rapidly behind his fogging spectacles. I don't know what you mean. Poirot approached with the patience of a physician coaxing a confession from a reluctant patient. Earlier, when I inspected the study, I observed that the financial documents had been disturbed recently, handled not merely by Lady Barrington, but by another. The oils from the fingertips, the slight misalignment of pages. Such things betray haste. Creswick scoffed softly. You can tell that simply by looking? Poirot did not turn to him. When one has spent a lifetime observing disorder, Doctor, even the smallest deviation speaks loudly. Brett swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. I may have entered the study earlier today, but not tonight. Lady Barrington requested clarifications. I delivered them. Poirot tilted his head. Earlier today. Not tonight. No, Brett insisted. I didn't go near her study after the reception began. A pause. Poirot let his eyes drift toward Brett's hands, ink smudged on one fingertip, precisely where it should not be if he had merely delivered documents hours earlier. But Poirot said nothing of this yet. Instead, he turned to Octavia Reed. "And you, mademoiselle, you are one who does not shy from private spaces in pursuit of a story." Her chin lifted. "I didn't enter the study. I considered it, yes, but I respect locked doors when there are witnesses." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, a practical ethic." Octavia shrugged. "A necessary one." Poirot allowed his gaze to fall next on Mrs. Vale. Her hands trembled as she adjusted a bracelet that had no need of adjustment. "Of course I didn't go into the study," she said, too breathless, too offended. "I would never intrude upon Eugenia's private space without permission." "But you argued with her," Poirot said mildly. "Perhaps you sought to reconcile, or confront her once more." Mrs. Vale's cheeks blazed. "I told you it was not an argument." Poirot did not contradict her. The truth was already visible in the cracks of her composure. Miss Fenton's voice rose anxiously. "I only entered when she sent me. I swear it, Monsieur Poirot." He nodded gently. "Yes, mademoiselle. Your distress is genuine. You entered only after the tragedy." Captain Marsh spoke next, his tone clipped. "I told you. I last saw her when she left to fetch her documents. I didn't follow her, and I didn't go to the study." Poirot studied him for several seconds, then turned quietly to Dr. Creswick. The doctor stiffened. "If you are implying that I entered the study without cause, I imply nothing," Poirot answered. "But you, more than anyone, would understand the effects of poison, its timing, its delivery." Creswick opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, his jaw tightening. Inspector Marsham broke the tension. "Poirot, perhaps we should check with the servants. They might know who passed through that corridor." Poirot's mustaches curved ever so slightly. "An excellent suggestion, Inspector, but unnecessary, for I believe someone in this room will recall the truth when pressed." He turned back to the guests. "Let us consider something simple. Lady Barrington was not expecting death. She was preparing action. Therefore, she must have interacted with someone shortly before retiring to the study." Mrs. Vale clasped her pearls. "You mean the murderer spoke to her?" "Not necessarily," Poirot said. "But it is likely that the murderer feared she would soon speak to the wrong person." Octavia's eyes flicked toward Brett. Poirot noted it. Creswick's glance darted toward Miss Fenton. Poirot noted that too. Poirot folded his hands. If Lady Barrington indeed summoned Miss Fenton for a document, she must have believed she still had time. Yet the poison took effect very quickly after ingestion. Creswick spoke reluctantly. "Some poisons do." "Exactly, Doctor," Poirot said. "And thus we must ask ourselves, when did she ingest it? Before she entered the study? Or once seated within it?" "Surely from the teacup," Brett murmured. Poirot turned to him. "A curious certainty, monsieur, particularly as the teacup was placed on the right. Contrary to Lady Barrington's habit, a staged cup, perhaps. A misleading one." Brett's cheeks flushed. I didn't mean—" "Of course not," Poirot said smoothly. "And yet you assume." Poirot let the tension rise once more, the storm punctuating it with a violent crack of thunder. "This," Poirot continued softly, "is the mistake I spoke of. The killer assumed that staging the scene would suffice, but habits, mes amis, are the truest indicators of human behavior. A left-handed woman does not reach for a right-placed cup unless compelled. And Lady Barrington was not compelled. She was already dying." A collective freeze swept through the room. Miss Fenton whispered, "You mean she was poisoned earlier? Much earlier?" Poirot nodded. "Oui. At the gathering, perhaps during a toast, perhaps through a gracious offering, perhaps in a manner most subtle." Mrs. Vale clutched the back of a chair. "No, surely no one here would dare risk poisoning others." "But poison," Poirot said, "can be administered in personal servings. A shared tray, a poured glass, a hand-delivered refreshment. He scanned their faces once more. Fear, guilt, defensiveness. The murderer, Poirot continued, was close enough to Lady Barrington tonight to offer her drink or food, or to ensure something she consumed was altered. He allowed the implications to simmer. Creswick muttered, "Then we must check every serving tray." Poirot lifted a finger. "Patience, Doctor. The answer does not lie in the trays. It lies in understanding Lady Barrington herself, and understanding the one who feared what she would reveal." He walked slowly back toward the fire. "The person who visited the study earlier tonight did so not to kill her, but to ensure something, to retrieve, to verify, to look for the very documents she circled." Octavia's breath caught, but she recovered too quickly. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, thinking. Someone, he whispered, knew precisely what she had uncovered. He opened his eyes again, gleaming with certainty. "And that is the person who entered the study." Several guests stepped back unconsciously, each afraid the detective's gaze might land upon them. Poirot observed their responses, the micro-expressions, the instinctive movements. Yes, the picture was becoming clearer. And now, with the storm beginning to relent and the night deepening, the true psychological game was beginning. A log in the fireplace cracked sharply, sending a bright ember spiraling upward before it vanished into the chimney. The small burst of flame illuminated the room for a fleeting instant, casting the guests into a tableau of unease, each face marked by the strain of suspicion, each posture betraying an internal battle. Poirot, standing at the room's center as though it were a stage prepared for his delicate performance, allowed the silence to breathe again. He turned slowly, letting his gaze pass over each guest. "The person who entered the study earlier tonight," he said quietly, "did so with a purpose. Not panic, not confusion, but intent. It was not an impulsive deed." Mrs. Vale clasped her hands so tightly the knuckles blanched. "Poirot, whoever it was, why would they go there before anything happened?" "To verify something," Poirot replied. "To confirm whether Lady Barrington had discovered their secret." Octavia Reed's eyes flicked briefly toward Brett again, an action Poirot observed, filed and momentarily ignored. Instead, he stepped toward Captain Marsh. "Tell me, mon capitaine, when you last spoke with Lady Barrington, did she mention her intention to confront anyone tonight?" "No," Marsh said, though hesitation crept into his voice. "She seemed preoccupied but determined. She said she needed to finalize matters." "Finalize," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "A word that suggests urgency." Miss Fenton swallowed audibly. "Monsieur Poirot, if she truly believed she uncovered something terrible, why didn't she call the police immediately?" Poirot regarded her kindly. "Because, mademoiselle, she was not certain of the identity she suspected, but suspicion alone is never enough. She needed proof, and tonight's gathering with all key individuals present provided the perfect stage for her final verification." Octavia stepped forward, frustration edging her tone. "And you believe one of us realized she was close to exposing them?" Poirot nodded. "Oui. Someone who knew that once she reviewed the documents thoroughly, their involvement would be undeniable." Brett's voice emerged unsteadily. "You keep mentioning documents. What exactly was she about to expose?" Poirot studied him carefully. "Misallocations in the Mercy Fund. Significant ones. Someone altered figures, redirected funds. At first glance, it appeared incompetence, but on closer inspection, deliberate manipulation." Creswick exhaled in disbelief. But why would anyone risk that? Lady Barrington ran her fund with near fanatical attention. "Which is why," Poirot said softly, "the culprit must have believed themselves beyond her suspicion, or assumed she would never discover the truth." Mrs. Vale pressed a trembling hand to her throat. "Poirot, She circled those entries tonight. That means she only realized very recently. Precisely, Poirot replied. It is the immediacy of her discovery that compelled the murderer to act quickly. Too quickly. The wind moaned through the eaves, mirroring the tension building within the drawing room. Poirot walked toward the tall window, inspecting the dark reflection of the room hovering in the glass. Behind him, footsteps shifted uneasily, small betrayals of fraying nerves. Murder committed in haste, Poirot continued, is always marked by error, and it is in these errors that the killer reveals themselves. Octavia crossed her arms. You spoke earlier of a mistake. Was it only the placement of the teacup? No, Poirot said. That was merely the first. There is another, a far more telling one. The guests leaned in. Even Creswick's impatience seemed momentarily overcome by dread. Poirot turned from the window. You see, mes amis, when someone enters a room with the intention to search, they leave subtle traces, a misaligned drawer, a shifted ornament, but the study contained something far more revealing. He paused, savoring the growing tension as a spider savors the trembling of a caught fly. The footprints on the carpet. The entire room stiffened. Poirot continued. The pattern of indentations indicated 2 visits, one by Lady Barrington herself and one by someone else. The second visitor did not sit. They hovered near the desk. They stood close enough to glimpse the circled entries. And when Lady Barrington arrived, they withdrew, perhaps intending to return later. Creswick frowned. But who has shoes distinctive enough to leave such identifiable marks? Poirot gave a small smile. Most shoes are distinctive if the observer looks carefully. The second set of prints was narrow, with a slight inward turn at the toe. He began walking slowly across the room, watching reactions closely. A hesitant stride, as though the wearer carried tension. Mrs. Vale clutched the armrest behind her. That could describe anyone. Not anyone, madame. He stopped in front of Adrian Brett. The solicitor's face drained of color. Me? No, I told you I wasn't there tonight. Poirot lowered his voice. Monsieur Brett, your shoes, narrow, inward turned at the toe. The pattern matches almost exactly, and the ink on your fingertip suggests recent handling of documents in haste. Brett stumbled back, shaking his head frantically. No, you're wrong. I swear I didn't go to the study tonight. Octavia's expression hardened. You knew she was reviewing the fund, didn't you? You knew she'd found something damning. Stop, Brett choked. It's not like that. I was trying to help her understand the entries. Poirot raised a calming hand. Let us not leap to conclusions. Monsieur Brett may have entered the study, but that alone does not prove guilt. It merely proves he sought knowledge. Perhaps to protect himself, perhaps to protect another. Another ripple of fear shifted through the room. Poirot's gaze swept across the remaining guests, each one now acutely aware of the quicksand beneath their feet. I seek not the frightened man, Poirot said softly, but the one who hides fear behind confidence, the one whose instinct is to control the narrative. His eyes landed on someone else now. Someone whose earlier composure he found a touch too deliberate, whose reactions were carefully measured, whose presence radiated intelligence sharpened into secrecy. Yes, Poirot thought. The psychological game had reached the point where facades began to fracture, and the next word spoken in this room would bring that fracture closer to breaking entirely. The hush in the drawing room deepened as Poirot's eyes settled, unblinking, upon Octavia Reed. She did not flinch, not outwardly, but something, a nearly imperceptible tightening around her eyes, betrayed the first crack in her mask. Poirot approached her with slow, deliberate steps, the faintest ghost of a smile playing beneath his mustache. Mademoiselle Reed, he said softly, you are remarkably composed for someone under suspicion of murder. A faint laugh escaped her, thin and brittle. I am an investigative journalist, Monsieur Poirot. Composure is a necessary shield. but if you believe it incriminating, then perhaps you mistake professionalism for guilt." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "but professionals also understand the value of information, how to gather it, how to conceal it, how to use it with precision, and tonight it is information that lies at the heart of this tragedy." Octavia's posture stiffened, though she lifted her chin as though unafraid. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot shook his head gently. "Not yet. But I find it interesting, mademoiselle, that your curiosity tonight has been so strategic." She narrowed her eyes. "Explain." Poirot gestured lightly toward the guests. "When suspicion fell upon Monsieur Brett, you were quick to press him, to guide attention. Earlier, when the fund misallocations were mentioned, you looked not surprised, but vindicated. And when I spoke of someone entering the study, you did not panic, you analyzed." "And is analysis a crime now?" she asked sharply. "No," Poirot said, "but analysis is the weapon of one who is not afraid of the truth, or one who believes they can control it." Captain Marsh stepped closer, anger flickering in his expression. "Are you saying she tampered with the fund? She barely knew Lady Barrington." Octavia's eyes flashed. "Correct. I barely knew her. Why would I kill her?" Poirot raised a finger. "But you did know her charity. You knew its controversies. You confronted her with questions, and she invited you here, not to dismiss you, but because she sensed her discovery aligned with your investigation. Is that not so?" Octavia hesitated. Only for a fraction of a second, but Poirot seized upon it. "I asked questions," she admitted. "And she answered them. She didn't show me the documents, if that's what you're suggesting." "She did not," Poirot agreed. "But you suspected more than she revealed. You are a woman who follows threads. You may have wanted to find the proof she withheld." Octavia's voice rose. "You think I snuck into her study to gather evidence? For a story?" "A possibility," Poirot said, "but not a certainty." He turned away suddenly, walking toward the corner where Miss Fenton stood trembling. "But let us not forget, mademoiselle, that others also hide truths." Miss Fenton blinked, startled. "Me? I have told you everything." "No," Poirot said gently. "Not everything. You see, mademoiselle, when you spoke earlier of being sent to the study, you mentioned Lady Barrington asked for the file for tomorrow. Yet when I inspected the desk, there were 2 trays prepared. One for tomorrow, yes, but one labeled immediate. You did not mention this second tray." Miss Fenton paled. I didn't think it mattered." "But it matters greatly," Poirot said. "For if Lady Barrington did not specify which tray, then her intention becomes unclear. Perhaps she wished you to fetch the file marked immediate. Why? What was so urgent she could not retrieve it herself?" Creswick muttered. "Poirot, this is stretching." Poirot lifted a hand to quiet him. "The urgency is what matters. And someone knew of that urgency. Someone who feared what lay in the immediate file." Mrs. Vale stepped forward suddenly, her composure cracking. "Why must we continue like this? You torment us with insinuations while the killer sits among us." Poirot turned to her calmly. "Because, madame, people reveal themselves through torment, through pressure, through contradictions. Already I've noted several." Her trembling intensified. "Contradictions?" Poirot nodded. "Yes. You claimed earlier that Lady Barrington dismissed your concern during your conversation. But now, under pressure, you said you were trying to calm her, to support her. Which story, madame, is the truth?" Mrs. Vale's lips parted, but no words came. Poirot stepped back into the center of the room, letting the tension build like a tightening wire. "You see, mes amis, each of you knows something you have not shared. Each of you bends the truth ever so slightly, and in these bends lies the silhouette of the murderer." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, as if urging him onward. Poirot folded his hands. "Now, we must consider the second great mistake the killer made, far greater than the misplacement of the teacup. All eyes fixed on him. The poison's timing. Brett whispered, "What do you mean?" Poirot's voice lowered, becoming almost tender. Lady Barrington died quickly, far too quickly for several types of poisons. That tells us something important. She had not ingested it long before her death. Creswick's brow furrowed. So it wasn't administered earlier, during the reception? "Ah, Doctor," Poirot said with a small bow. "You are clever, but you overlook the nuance. The poison began its effect earlier. That dizziness she reported to you, but did not reach its fatal peak until minutes before the scream. That means it was administered twice, once subtly, once decisively." Gasps erupted around the room. Miss Fenton clutched her chest. "Twice? How is that possible?" "Very possible," Poirot said. "A mild dose in a shared beverage. A stronger dose in something she consumed alone with someone she trusted." Mrs. Vale shook her head violently. "No, no one here was alone with her." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Incorrect. One person was. The person who visited the study earlier, the person who ensured the second dose was ready when Lady Barrington returned." Octavia's eyes widened. "The murderer waited in the study?" "Not waited," Poirot said. "Prepared." A heavy silence fell, as suffocating as the storm clouds pressing against the windows. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, the kind that cut deeper than a shout. "And now, mes amis, we must ask which among you possessed both knowledge and access." His gaze drifted slowly across the room. "But the hour is late. And the truth? The truth draws near. The killer's identity is nearly revealed." For the first time, fear overtook every face. And Poirot felt, with the certainty of the ticking clock behind him, that the next confrontation would shatter the final veil the murderer still clung to. The words seemed to echo long after Poirot had spoken them, as though the very walls of Mercy Court absorbed the revelation and released it back upon the room with renewed force. Twice poisoned. The idea unsettled every guest, unraveling the fragile composure they had struggled to maintain. Thunder rolled again, low and ominous, as if underscoring the revelation with a steady drumbeat of dread. Poirot let the panic simmer for only a moment before he raised one hand, drawing silence back to him as effortlessly as a conductor reclaiming control of an orchestra. His gaze swept the room with quiet authority. "The first dose," he said, "was one the murderer hoped would go unnoticed. The second, however, was deliberate, timed to coincide with Lady Barrington's moments alone." Octavia Reed stared at him, her voice sharp though steady. But who could get close enough to her without drawing attention? She wasn't wandering the house freely. Poirot inclined his head. "Just so, mademoiselle. She was discreet, purposeful. And the killer relied on this pattern, knowing she would go to the study before confronting the guilty party." Mrs. Vale gasped softly. "She went there alone, trusting that she was safe." "And someone exploited that trust," Poirot murmured. Captain Marsh stepped forward, frustration overtaking his earlier restraint. "Poirot, for heaven's sake, if someone slipped into the study to plant the second dose, wouldn't Miss Fenton have seen them leaving?" Poirot shook his head. "Not necessarily. The study has two doors, the main entrance and a secondary one leading to the small writing alcove. That door, mon capitaine, was partially concealed by the tall bookcases. A discreet exit." Inspector Marsham's eyebrows rose. "I hadn't noticed a second door." Poirot's mustaches twitched. "You were occupied, Inspector. Understandably so. But the architecture of old houses always tells a story. The murderer entered through one door, prepared the second dose, likely within the teacup, and then slipped out the other." Miss Fenton let out a small cry. "But the door to the alcove, it's nearly always closed. Locked, even." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Nearly always. But tonight it was not. Someone unlocked it." A chorus of gasps broke through the room. Adrian Brett staggered backward as though retreating from invisible blows. You think the killer entered that way? Not through the corridor? It is the only explanation that fits the footprints, Poirot said. For the second set did not approach the study from the main entrance. They approached the desk from the side, precisely where the alcove door is located. Octavia folded her arms, staring intently at Poirot. Then the question is simple. Who had access to that alcove? Who knew the door was rarely monitored? Poirot's eyes glimmered. Just so. He turned deliberately toward Dr. Creswick. The doctor stiffened. What now, Poirot? You have been quick, Poirot said quietly. To defend possibilities, to dismiss others, and earlier, when I spoke of poison, your reaction was not one of shock, but calculation. Creswick's jaw clenched. I'm a physician. Calculation is part of the job. Indeed, Poirot said, but calculation can also mask fear. Creswick's eyes hardened. Are you accusing me? Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. Doctor, you carry keys to medicine cabinets, to your kit, and you are familiar with Lady Barrington's health. The dizziness she described to you was not a mere coincidence. It was the poison's first effect. Creswick took a step forward, fists clenched. Anyone could have slipped something into her drink before I saw her. You cannot place this at my feet. Poirot's voice remained calm. I do not place it, doctor. I only follow the trace. You were the last person to hear her complaint, and yet you told no one until asked. Why is that? Creswick opened his mouth, floundered, then forced composure. Because I thought it trivial. A momentary imbalance. Poirot's silence indicated he did not believe him, but then the detective turned suddenly away, shifting the room's focus once more. Yet, he continued softly, Dr. Creswick was not the only one with access to the alcove. The door leads to the old writing room once used by the Barrington family lawyer. Adrian Brett froze. Poirot approached him slowly, his voice gentle but piercing. Monsieur Brett, you handled Lady Barrington's documents. You knew the layout of the study well. The alcove door unlocks with a simple pressure pin mechanism, one you would undoubtedly be familiar with. Brett's trembling intensified. Poirot, please, I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. Poirot studied him carefully. No. You are frightened, yes. But frightened men do not commit such calculated acts. He turned once more, and this time he let his gaze rest upon someone who had tried very hard to remain part of the background. Someone who blended effortlessly into the room yet observed everything with razor-sharp attention. Miss Clara Fenton. She stiffened visibly when Poirot's eyes met hers. Mademoiselle, Poirot said softly, you have been loyal to Lady Barrington for years. You knew her habits, her schedule, her secrets. Fenton's voice cracked. I served her. I adored her. Poirot stepped closer. Which is why you would know precisely when she planned to visit the study tonight, and you, mademoiselle, had access to the alcove. You often used it to store correspondence and supplies. She shook her head violently. No, that's not true. I hardly ever... Poirot cut her off gently. 2 days ago, you were seen entering the alcove to retrieve stationery. The butler confirmed it. Her lips parted in shock. Poirot continued, and when I examined the alcove door tonight, I found a faint smear of ink on the latch, ink from fingers. Miss Fenton stared at her hands, horror dawning as she saw the faint smudge she had failed to wash completely. No, she whispered. Please, no. Mrs. Vale gasped. Clara, but she loved Eugenia. Poirot bowed his head. Love, madame, can twist into something far more dangerous when threatened. Miss Fenton backed away, shaking. I didn't poison her. I didn't. I swear. Poirot's voice was firm. Mademoiselle, the first dose? No. You were not responsible. But the second, the fatal one, came from the cup you prepared. Tears streamed down her face, but still she shook her head. I only did what she asked. I only made tea. I didn't know. Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice held steady. And that, mademoiselle, is the key. The guests froze, uncertain where the truth now pointed. Poirot stepped back, letting the storm's dying groan fill the silence. I begin to see the picture more clearly, he said softly. The final deception, the true motive, the mastermind behind it all. He lifted his chin, mustaches impeccable as ever. And now, mes amis, we approach the final gathering. A hush fell over the room so absolute that even the dying rumble of the storm seemed reluctant to intrude. Miss Fenton's tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, her breath shuddering as though her body struggled to understand the weight Poirot had placed upon her. Yet Poirot's gaze had softened, not with pity, but with the precision of a surgeon who knew he was inches from the heart of the truth. Mademoiselle, he said gently, your actions were guided by loyalty, not malice. You brewed the tea, yes, but only because Lady Barrington trusted you implicitly. The poison, that was introduced before the cup ever passed into your hands. Miss Fenton looked up, eyes wide. Then, someone tampered with it before I took it to the study? Poirot inclined his head. Exactement. And the murderer relied upon your innocence. They knew you would be the perfect messenger. Mrs. Vale exhaled shakily. But who? Who would dare use Clara like that? Poirot turned slowly, letting anticipation coil itself around the guests like a tightening serpent. A person who needed proximity, one who could appear helpful, concerned, protective even. Someone Lady Barrington would accept a drink from without hesitation. He paused deliberately. And someone who wished the second dose to be delivered at precisely the right moment. Captain Marsh's jaw tightened. Poirot, if you're about to accuse— Patience, mon capitaine, Poirot murmured, for your reaction reveals more emotion than logic. Marsh froze, posture stiffening under Poirot's scrutiny. But no, Poirot continued, you are not the mastermind. You are a man haunted, but not one who orchestrates poisonings. Poirot now turned toward Dr. Creswick. The doctor shifted uncomfortably, sweat gleaming at his temples despite the cooling room. You possessed the knowledge, Poirot acknowledged. You understood how the poison would act. But you would not choose such a method. Not when you know how easily it would reveal its nature. Doctors who kill often choose subtlety, not spectacle. Creswick's shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Poirot walked toward the fireplace, letting the crackling embers cast long shadows across his features. The person responsible needed two things: access to the fund's documents and an intimate understanding of Lady Barrington's private routines. His gaze settled on Adrian Brett. Brett let out a strangled sound. No, I didn't. Poirot, I didn't poison her. I only checked the documents because I feared she misunderstood something. And that fear, Poirot said softly, makes you a poor criminal. You tremble, monsieur. You confess before accusation. You wear your guilt upon your brow. But it is guilt of cowardice, not murder. Brett sank into a chair, covering his face with trembling hands. Poirot now turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the last person he had not confronted fully. Mrs. Romilda Vale. She stood motionless, as though rooted to the floor, her fingers still clutching at the pearls around her throat. Her expression was carefully blank. Too blank. Not the terror of the innocent, nor the outrage of the falsely accused. Instead, a stillness. A waiting. Poirot approached her with a grace almost theatrical in its precision. Mrs. Vale, he said softly, you were Lady Barrington's closest confidant. You knew her habits, her routines, her principles. You also knew, did you not, that she suspected betrayal within the Mercy Fund? Mrs. Vale's lips tightened. She suspected inefficiencies. Nothing more. No, madame, Poirot said gently. She suspected you. Gasps erupted around the room, but Mrs. Vale did not flinch. If anything, her composure hardened, calcified. Poirot continued, "You were the one who encouraged certain hospitals to request inflated sums. You channeled funds into accounts you controlled, discreetly, cleverly. Lady Barrington trusted you, and trust is the easiest door to walk through. But when she began to question discrepancies, she turned to someone she believed impartial." Brett's head jerked up, horrified. She spoke to me." Poirot nodded. "She asked you to review the allocations quietly, and when you confirmed irregularities, she confronted Mrs. Vale. The conversation, Mrs. Burse, Vale minimized earlier, was no conversation at all. It was an accusation." Mrs. Vale's voice was icy calm. "She misunderstood. I tried to explain." "No," Poirot said gently. "You tried to prevent her from acting. When she refused to be swayed, you realized she intended to reveal your misconduct tonight. You knew she would withdraw your role from the fund, and that your scheme, years in the making, would collapse." Mrs. Vale took a slow breath. "You have a clever imagination, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot nodded politely. "I thank you, but imagination is not required. Only observation." He stepped back slightly, his voice firm but steady. "You visited the study first. You saw the circled documents, and you realized she had at last uncovered your deception. That was your first moment of panic. Your second came when she left the reception to prepare her final notes. You acted swiftly, introducing a mild dose into her drink, perhaps in a moment of apparent concern." Octavia Reed exhaled sharply, realization dawning. "And then she sent Clara for tea." Poirot nodded. At the perfect moment, Mrs. Vale followed quietly to the alcove, slipping the second dose into the waiting cup. Then she left by the concealed door, unseen by Miss Fenton. Miss Fenton covered her mouth in horror. "No, she used me." Poirot bowed his head sadly. "Yes, mademoiselle. The murderer often uses innocence as a shield." Mrs. Vale finally lowered her hand from her pearls. Her expression remained eerily composed. "You truly believe I would kill Eugenia, my dearest friend?" Poirot met her gaze evenly. "You killed her because she was your dearest friend. She trusted you so completely that she became the perfect victim. Trust is a powerful weapon when wielded by the wrong hands." Mrs. Vale's silence stretched thin. Poirot added softly, "And because she was your friend, your hatred, when she threatened your future, was all the sharper." Something in Mrs. Vale's eyes flickered. A shadow, a fracture. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "What gave me away?" Poirot smiled sadly. "Two things. Your lie about your conversation, and the fact that you were the only one who never once asked how she died." Mrs. Vale swayed as though the truth itself had struck her, and the storm, now spent, fell silent at last. The room remained suspended in shock, as though the revelation itself had stolen the very breath from the assembled guests. Mrs. Vale stood utterly still, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight, an elegant statue carved from grief, guilt, and calculation. Poirot regarded her gently, not triumphantly. He never took pleasure in the unveiling of human frailty, however dark its shape. Inspector Marsham stepped forward, hesitation warring with duty. "Mrs. Vale, I must ask you to come with me, for questioning." His voice wavered slightly. The polite euphemism fooled no one. Mrs. Vale met his gaze with a composed resignation that unnerved even the bravest in the room. "Yes," she whispered. "I suppose you must." She looked then to Poirot, her expression softening into something unexpectedly vulnerable. "You see everything, monsieur, even the parts one wishes to hide." Poirot inclined his head, his tone quiet and solemn. "It is not genius, madame. It is humanity. We are creatures of motive, of fear, of desire. Even the most elegant mask trembles when the heart beneath it falters. A faint smile touched her lips, a haunting, tragic curve. Eugenia trusted me, and I betrayed her. That is the true poison, Monsieur Poirot. Not what was in her cup. She allowed Inspector Marsham to take her arm. As the inspector escorted her from the room, the remaining guests watched in a stunned, reverent silence. The door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click, an ending and a beginning. Poirot turned back to the others. "Mes amis," he said quietly, "the mystery is solved. But let us not forget the deeper lesson. Murder is rarely born of hatred alone. It is born of love twisted, of ambition unchecked. In this case, a friend feared disgrace more than she cherished loyalty." Dr. Creswick exhaled shakily, wiping his brow. "I never suspected her, not for a moment." Poirot's mustaches twitched. "That, Doctor, is because she played her role too well. The confidant, the companion, the unwavering supporter. Yet it is often the one who stands closest to the flame who feels its heat most keenly." Miss Fenton sank into a nearby chair, covering her face. "I cannot believe it. She used me. Used my trust. Lady Barrington trusted her so completely." Poirot's voice softened. "Do not burden yourself, mademoiselle. The murderer relied upon your innocence because innocence does not suspect deceit. You acted with loyalty. That is never a fault." Captain Marsh placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. She nodded, tears glistening but no longer falling. Adrian Brett let out a trembling sigh. "Poirot, what will become of the Mercy Fund now?" "Ah," Poirot replied, "that is a matter for the trustees. But with Lady Barrington's documents preserved and her intentions clear, justice, financial and moral, will be restored. In time." He smoothed his cuffs, glancing toward the window where the storm clouds were lifting at last, revealing a silvery moonlit sky. Octavia Reed stepped forward, her sharp features softened by an unusual introspection. "You've given these people closure, and Lady Barrington justice." Poirot gave her a small, courteous bow. "I merely listened to what was said and to what was unsaid. The truth often hides not in shadows, but in silence." She nodded thoughtfully. "I see that now." Poirot clasped his hands. "And now, mes amis, I believe the ordeal is concluded. The storm has passed, outside and within." One by one, the guests began to disperse, each carrying with them the heavy aftermath of what had unfolded within those walls. Miss Fenton and Captain Marsh lingered near the hearth, speaking in low tones. Dr. Creswick, humbled and shaken, retreated to gather his medical kit. Adrian Brett, a man chastened by fear but freed from suspicion, bowed deeply before slipping out. Poirot remained by the window, gazing at the moonlit sea crashing rhythmically against the cliffs. Inspector Marsham returned briefly to thank him, gratitude written plainly in his weary features. "Poirot, I don't know how you see what others miss." Poirot smiled. "It is simple, Inspector. In every crime there is order, buried beneath the chaos. One must merely tidy the threads." Marsham chuckled softly, shook his head, and departed. Finally, Poirot stepped away from the window, stretching his shoulders with quiet satisfaction. "It is time," he murmured to himself, "for a warm tisane, and perhaps, after tonight, a moment's reflection." As he made his way toward the corridor, he paused one last time to look around the drawing room. The scene of fear, of revelation, of justice restored. The fire had settled into a gentle glow, and the once writhing storm had given way to a calm night. Poirot smiled faintly. "Order," he said softly, "has been restored." And with that, Hercule Poirot, immaculate in his poise, precise in his step, and ever faithful to the little grey cells, departed Mercy Court with the calm dignity of a man who had glimpsed the frailties of human nature and understood them, yet judged them only with truth. The affair at the Mercy killings was concluded. But the wisdom of Hercule Poirot, as always, endured.